Hey guys, Keith here, picking up on my previous video, exploring all of the changes essentially through the back half of 2020. Last video, I think we got to the end of 2020.26, so we're picking up from 2020.27. And the first change is a change that Scott made, and he did put a short video out on Facebook, I think, to cover this, but we'll cover it here. We'll just throw an extra layer in here. Essentially what Scott's added is you can highlight either a row or a column or even a rectangle of cells here, and if you come down to the bottom, there's a number selected horizontal left to right, and it will insert the numbers starting with whatever channels down here. So if I want to do a set here that starts at 100, I'd put 100 in there, highlight the cells that I want to number, numbers selected, vertical top to bottom, and starts at 100 and numbers down. You can also do a rectangle, in which case it will number a zigzag. So it can be a useful way to rapidly fill numbers in here rather than typing in one each individually or clicking many times. It depends, of course, on the type of model that you're trying to create, but it can be a shortcut way of achieving that outcome. The next one it's a slight odd one because we've been able to do this for quite some time now. Let's just open a sequence. Here we'll just pick a sequence, one that's maybe got a few images in it. For some time now, to fix things like a video effect where it was rendering in red, we've had an ability to come up here and bulk edit. So you'd select the effect, you'd press Control A to select everything, then you'd come over here and you'd bulk edit the path, and you'd set the path to all the videos. And that's great, and it works good, except where all the videos don't happen to sit in the same folder underneath the show folder. And then it can get a bit messy. Things don't quite work as you might expect. So if someone had packaged the sequence and they'd had a video folder and they'd had a whole bunch of videos in the video folder, but maybe they included one other video that was in the lost folder. And so consequently, not everything is in the same folder. And if you do a bulk edit path and you point to the videos folder, it won't fix that one that was in the other folder. So there is another option here now called bulk edit show folder, and essentially what that allows you to do is choose the folder that is the show folder that you're importing from, and then every directory that's relative to that, regardless of how many there are, it will set the path accordingly. And so that can solve that problem where all of the images maybe weren't in the same folder or all of the videos weren't in the same folder. You can now bulk edit and point at the show folder and trust that as long as they were relative to the show folder, everything should pick up okay. So that's another option for fixing what is common, very common import problem that people experience. The next one's a couple of things, or one thing around FPP Connect. I won't show it because there's no real need to, but Dan has made the FPP smarter over the course of the year, and one of the things that he's made smarter is it kind of knows when it needs to reboot or restart the FPPD, or the daemon that runs on FPP. Essentially, when you change any of the core configuration of FPP, you have to stop and restart the FPPD process, which then picks up the new configuration and allows it to output. And now the FPP Connect is slightly smarter. It knows when that needs to be restarted, and it will actually send an instruction to the FPP to restart. And that way, when you do then log on to your FPP instance, you don't as often get that colored bar saying, hey, you need to restart FPPD, because it's already been restarted when the upload occurred. In 2027, there was also 2020.27. There was also a bunch of performance optimizations around the render pools, etc. In fact, there's been a number of those over the course of the year, mostly contributed by Dan, where he's tried to tune a number of effects, increase the amount of parallelism, fix up some of the thread pools, and put some optimization around the render pipeline, and that's improved performance. Incrementally. I mean, there hasn't been massive changes in performance, but every little bit helps and accumulates over the course of the year. There was also some improvements that he put in with the video preview window. Most people don't know that this exists. If you've got a sequence which is based off a video file, there's actually a window up here which is called the video preview that you can open up, and it's not going to have anything on it right here. But if I'd built this sequence using a video file as my audio track, when I play the sequence, it would actually show the video here on the screen, so you can coordinate what's going on in the sequence with the video a lot easier. And so Dan's done a bunch of improvements, primarily relating to OS X, some improvements to the hardware video decoding and that video preview. The next change, 2020.29, there was only bug fixes in 28. 29 had some changes around system color changes and how OS X handled what happens when you go into the operating system and change some colors. As most people know, OS X supports dark mode and things like that. So there's some improvements in that handling as well, which I can't demonstrate here on a Windows machine. In 2020.30, Dan added the ability to support multiple media directories, and you can see that in the Preferences dialog. If you come in here to the Sequences tab, you can see that you can have multiple media and resource directories, and so you can add multiple folders in here that xLights will scan for your media. There was also some enhancements around the video exporter. Most people would know that there is this video exporter in here. Now, before you do that, please make sure that you have your model or your house preview up. You should also make this window as big as possible, because it actually exports the video at the resolution of the video. So you want to have it as big as you can, and then you would come up and do some exporting and then enhance some of the logging that goes around that, so that when problems occur, we get better information about why it failed. So this was an enhancement that Scott put in place, and I believe that's all included. And we talked about that a little bit with the visualizer the other day, where if you're in the visualizer and you're on a controller that supports banks, and this one here does. This is a Falcon, and I happen to have a bunch of expansion ports. And so as you drop things on here, and if I was to go to town on here, so now we're starting to get there. And so at the moment we're getting some gap errors. That's okay. Gap errors can be handled by the controller, but if we keep adding too many of these, oh, there we go, we hit it. So now there's additional errors down here. So the bank channel count, 3, which is 1060, which is over the maximum, which is 1024. It also tells us which are the largest ports. So in bank 1, it tells us that port 7 has 960 pixels, which it does. And it tells us that on bank 2, port 17 has 100. In fact, several of them have 100, but it finds the first one, which is largest. And basically, I would need to go and reduce one of these two down in order to solve that problem. So having these sort of errors makes it a lot easier to debug issues with configurations that are not compatible with your controller. LAW S5 strand, channel and strand importing. Again, a little bit hard to show, but something that not many people realize. We do actually support the importing of LAW S5 sequences. If I create a new sequence here, and then I will have to go and find a LAW sequence to import, and I have a few of these that various people have sent me, so just give me a second and we'll go and find those. So here's a number. Now I cannot remember which one was demonstrating the problem. This is definitely experimental. It's actually not bad. Definitely better than it was a year ago. And in this case, there was some changes around bringing in strands, etc., which doesn't seem to be demonstrated by this particular sequence. But basically, this is all of a LAW sequence, and you can bring it across from S5 and import it into xLights. I'm not going to go hunting around for an exact one that includes strands and channels and strands, but that would just basically be additional items over here that you could drag across onto individual strands on some of my props over here, like, you know, down onto my strands on my tree, etc. But yeah, I don't think I need to get into that. It's not a very common thing that people will use. Got added support for FLAC audio, so when you're creating a audio sequence and you choose this, one of the many audio file types that are now supported is the FLAC format, so additional formats that you can use. Scott also added to the layout in the model download, and I actually think I showed this the other day, but maybe I didn't. But when you're in the model download dialog and you're trying to download a model from one of the vendors, you can now do a search down here. So if I'm looking for, I don't know, a Grinch model, I can now click search here. I didn't find any Grinches. That's not useful. What else might we look for? Maybe a wreath. And so it's found the first instance of the wreath. And if I click search again, it will find the next one, and so on down through the various wreaths. And I can quickly flick through each of the suppliers looking for wreaths that I might be interested in and choose the one that best suits my needs. So the next one is 2020.32. This was a change or an addition in the controllers that was supported. So we added the Minleon controllers, and specifically the RGB NDB Plus controller. Not commonly used in the hobby, but in the professional landscape, the Minleon lights are a more professional grade, and this is one of the controllers that they commonly use to run their lights. And so this supports, basically it has an awareness of the configurations that are supported by Minleon, so there's a lot of validation that goes in here, and there's also actually an upload. So if this was valid, and you can actually do an upload to the controller as well, so that's also supported with this particular controller type. Lower the arch minimum hollowness to 0. So with some of the new arch forms that or types of arches that came out this year, there was actually a few enhancements to the arch model. When you have a layered arch, you can now add multiple layers in here, but you now also have this option. So let's make it 50 nodes. 50 nodes at arch, and so now you have this layered option. And if it's not layered, then obviously it's just a single arch, but if it's layered, you get those that ability to do that layered arch. Now I've gone and mucked all the numbers up again. It does jump around a little if you do things in odd orders. But you can now also reduce this hollowness, and so there are some arches out there that effectively want the inside to be 1, and they have a hollowness of 0, which means it's basically a dot at the center. Obviously it's probably not 3, it's many of these, and it's more like a fan, I guess, at the end of the day. But yeah, that hollowness can now go to 0. Previously I think it bottomed out at 20% or something, so that's now 0. So the next one was a change to check sequence. And I'm not going to go and actually do this, but effectively here under the dimming curves, you can define a dimming curve to define the prop. And one of the things that you can change is the brightness here. And if I counted someone who had essentially set their brightness on their dimming curve here to -100, and then couldn't understand why when they dropped an effect onto their prop, nothing came up. And so and it's one of those ones, right? And I get these all the time. People send me a show and they say this effect is not working right. Why is it not working right? And normally it's an effect setting that they've got wrong, and I've got some tricks which help me quickly identify when they've set something weird on the effects. But in this case, it was basically impossible to find. I couldn't find it anywhere, and I had to run through all the code, and eventually it turned out that they'd set one of these dimming curves to -100, which effectively just turned all the lights off. So now if you do something like that, it will actually flag it in check sequence and warn you that it's actually going to result in no lights coming on, which hopefully will help people spot that problem more quickly. So now we're up to 2020.35, and the first one is a change that David introduced, which sorts the models in this import. So we choose an RGBFX file from another layout, and what he's done is he's ensured that this is sorted. And while I'm in here, I should also highlight that there is a bunch of right-click options here that help you quickly detect things or select things. So here I can select siblings, selects everything that's within that particular part of the hierarchy, but it doesn't select anything that's outside of that hierarchy. I can deselect them. I can also select all groups or select all models or deselect anything that already seems to exist inside my layout. Maybe I've imported them before. So there's a bunch of options there as well that can maybe make that a little bit quicker to get through. There were some other enhancements. We talked a little bit about FPP Connect earlier, and Dan, and this has gone on for some time. There's been a number of changes around FPP Connect's detection of FPP. It's waxed and waned a little bit. There's sometimes when it's done a really good job. Sometimes it's been doubling up or missing things, and so there's a bunch of changes that Dan's made over a number of releases, including being smarter about recognizing the hints that we may have provided elsewhere. So putting in things like a proxy in here, or knowing that we've connected to it, found it before, and then doing an extra check to make sure that it's not actually there and that we didn't miss it in the discovery process of opening up FPP Connect. So a bunch of changes there, which it's been iterating its way forward and getting better over time with a few backward steps along the way, but I think we're pretty good right now. Adding support for the new Pixel Stick firmware. So if you happen to choose the S Pixel Stick in here, there's now additional firmware versions in the model here, which offer some different capabilities, including some additional protocols and some things like that. There is a change in here on the tree model here. When you come down and you look at the number of strings, you'll notice that this tooltip comes up when you go to the strings property, saying that this is typically the number of connections from your prop to your controller. This is a very lame maybe attempt to try and give a hint to people about how they should be choosing this. We experience lots of issues where people who are setting trees up for the first time don't necessarily get these three parameters right. It's understandable, and the tooltip there is trying to sort of give them a hint as to how they should fill them in. Fortunately, it's not a hard thing to fix, and it can be fixed quite late in the piece without really damaging anything, maybe another render, etc., unless they've done something really weird with their tree. There was also in 2020-34, there was an enhancement to the auto map. You would all know the auto map feature. And this is going to be a little bit hard to show, but just so that everyone's got their context. If you're importing a sequence, one of the things you've got down here is the auto map, and what that does is it looks through the names here and tries to find a match over here. There were some enhancements that went in over here, and the auto map's done an atrocious job here. Oh, it's found 1 star. That's all it's managed to find. But there were some enhancements to this auto map to try and do a slightly better job of finding things that are really close but not quite a perfect match, just to reduce the number of things that you need to manually map, although obviously in this instance it didn't do a particularly good job. Added export of submodel details. So this is, again, if we're in here and we've got a model that's got some submodels and we go into here, you can now export those submodels here to a file. Let's throw that on our desktop. And here it is. So here's my submodel, what type of submodel it is, whether it's a vertical buffer or not, and then each of the rows. In this case, each one of these is just a single row, so it shows up as a bottom row and it lists the node ranges that are included in that particular submodel. So in 2020.34, Scott's added serial protocol. So you add a USB, you can now choose this generic serial. It's extremely basic. It probably could, we could probably go a little bit further with it, which we haven't done yet. Maybe add some headers and footers or something to the packets. But at the moment, it's just generic serial, which means it just pushes the data out in a pretty raw sense out to that particular port. So now we're at 2020.35, and this one we're going to go and open up a sequence, and we will pick a sequence which has a lyric track in it. And historically, it's never been possible to actually undo a lyric track. So once you've started to break a track down into lyrics, you could never undo it in the past. But now you can. There is the ability down here to remove the phonemes and remove the words and phonemes if you choose on the second layer, and same at the top layer. And that allows you to basically strip it out and undo it. Whereas previously, once you'd done that, the only option was to delete the whole thing and start again. And if you just want to delete one of the layers, like the phonemes, and then redo those separately, that allows you to do so. Okay, so the next change in 2020.36 relates to FPP Connect. So I've actually gone and turned on a couple of my FPPs. So I have a cult board and some just regular FPPs, one with a pi cap on it. And the changes here are quite simple. So there's the ability to sort these things. So you can now click on these, sort it by date, sort it by name, sort it by media file, which can be useful, particularly the modified date if you're particularly interested to understand when things were recently changed. So if you've just rendered a bunch of sequences and you want them at the top, you can easily click on that. So that's the key change there. There's also some smarts behind the scenes in terms of whether a file's been changed and whether it needs to be sent to FPP as well, which can speed up some of the loading. Dan also added some changes around the detection of ES pixel sticks. Sometimes the FPP Connect here can actually find other things other than just FPP devices, and one of them is the ES pixel sticks. And so where you have a pixel stick which actually accepts a local FSCQ file, Dan's added the ability to upload those to it. We had also added some timing track value curves. So timing track value curves just add to the list of things that value curves can trigger off. And essentially what we want here is we need a timing track with some timing marks. So let's just create some. That looks good. And let's go down to our matrix if we can find it. And what we will do is let's just do something simple. Let's just put the on effect on it, and we'll stretch it out across those effects. And let's look at our transparency here and bring up the value curve. Well, there's now some value curves here which are timing track. So a timing track, a toggle, we can choose that. We do need to point it at the timing track, so it's pointing at new timing. And if we click OK, and let's go down and have a look at what the render data is doing. You can see what it's doing is as it hits each timing mark, it toggles on and off. So the first timing mark it hits, it toggles on, then it toggles off, and then toggles on, and so forth. There is also a fade fixed. And so fade fixed allows you to use this control here over the number of frames that it fades over, but it's a fixed amount. So the fade occurs over a fixed number of frames regardless of the separation between the timing marks. So everything fades at the same rate, and if the timing marks are shorter together, then obviously it might stop fading and go back to black again. In this case, we're fading up. And that's because I've got low to high. If I reverse this around, it obviously would have faded from high to low. I can also choose the proportional, and in this case, the fade is actually proportional to the gap between the timing tracks. So it always ends at 100%, and it fades with a similar shape and holds white for longer or proportionally longer on each one. So yeah, some ways in which to, again, try to automate the sorts of things that otherwise people would do manually by providing tools that let you take advantage of the things that you generally already have, a whole bunch of timing tracks to automate the sequencing of things. Now, this is a value curve, so you can apply this to anything. This could be, we could come up here and do this on the pinwheel and apply that value curve to the thickness. And so we could say, fade proportional. And so now it widens and shrinks at each timing mark. Again, just a different way of sequencing and maybe a way of speeding up your sequencing. So 38 was when I added real-world dimensions into the 3D layout. So this was the ruler and the ability to set the dimensions of something on your 3D layout and then have everything else measured against it and real-world dimensions being shown. And there's actually a video that I made on that. If I remember at the end, I'll link it at the end in the video. We also added center controls to the ripple. So the ripple effect is this one here, and there's now center controls, so you can move the ripple into the corner instead of just in the middle. Previously it could only exist in the middle, and there's obviously also value curves on it, so you can move the ripple around over the course of the effect and have it move across. All the usual things. We added color dropper support to chroma key and sparkles. What does that mean? Well, the droppers are interesting. These are both value curve droppers and color droppers are things that surprisingly few people use because they're not a default, and then people don't go exploring for them. So let me show them to you. If you come up to Windows, there's a color dropper. And what this does is this gives you all of the colors which are available, all of the colors that are hidden within here. Any colors that you've used inside your sequence are all represented here on a single grid of available colors. And I can just come here and grab one of these colors and say, just drop it over here onto here, and it changes to blue. So it's a really quick way to quickly change the colors. And what this change in particular was all about is I can actually come over and drop them onto the sparkles and also onto the chroma key. If I had that enabled, I could drag that there as well. So the color dropper is essentially able to drag it onto all those sorts of things. This is really powerful. If you're doing lots and lots of sequencing and you want to change colors all the time, it is so much quicker to get here and just quickly drag things across and set your colors up on an effect than it is to go and click and drag, etc. Unless, of course, you've got a full palette in here, which is pretty quick as well. The other one, while I'm at it, I may as well show the value curve dropper. And so the value curve dropper has all of the value curves that normally appear down here available up here. And again, you can quickly drag them down and drop them down here and apply the value curves like that. Now you can of course add to these just like you can add to the colors. If you come into the value curve here, you can export them and store those value curve files into your show folder, and then they will get picked up and listed here as well. So you can build up a whole collection of value curves as just the same as you can set up a whole collection of palettes and colors which you can then drag and drop across from here and save yourself a bunch of time when you're sequencing. 2020.40, some minor changes. The null controller, which not very many people use, but sometimes people use it for things like virtual matrices and the like. We increased the maximum number of channels here substantially. It's now 2 million, I think. Hopefully no one's using 2 million, but we tried to throw that number sufficiently far out there that people that were trying to go with very high resolution on their virtual matrices weren't going to run out of channels on the null controllers. That's also true of the DDP controller. So if you're using a DDP controller here, the maximum number of channels here is now 2 million as well. So really, really large. Again, I doubt anyone would be using it, but hey, you never know. Okay, there's another change here for FPP where Dan is looking when he goes to upload the FSCQ file. Normally he would look for the XSQ file and find the media that's associated with the sequence so that he could update upload it. But however, there are circumstances where maybe that XSQ file is nowhere to be seen and there's just the FSCQ file, or the FSCQ file also contains a pointer to the media file. And so if you can't find the XSQ file, he'll look at the media file inside the FSCQ header and try and pick it up from there if you can't find it in any other way. Adding cut effects to the row and model. So this is a sequencer thing. You can now come in here and do a row cut effects and model cut effects, and then of course you can paste the effects somewhere else. The ability to create a timing track from a row of effects. So this one's interesting. So we've had a few people come in, typically with imported sequences that they've bought in from other sequences maybe, and they had a bunch of effects that they've bought in, and they'd like to create a timing track which reflects the timing of these effects. And there's no easy way to do so, but there is now. If you right click here, come down to row and say create timing from effects, it will generate a new timing track here which matches those particular effects. And so, for instance, if you've done a bunch of things like flash and fades that you could have done with a VU meter, and now you just want to create a timing track, and then you'll drop a VU meter down and do it all in one effect, that would be a very quick way of doing that sort of conversion. 2020.41 was also where we introduced the disabling of rendering of individual effects. Again, I think I made a video on this when it first came out. Essentially, you can click on an effect, or you can select multiple effects, do a Control A, select all the effects, and you can come in here and disable or enable render. The typical place that you'd want to use this is, let's say you had some crazy large P5 panel and you'd done a bunch of sequencing on it. Thousands, hundreds, thousands, million channels, etc. It's going to take some time to render. And once you've sequenced it, you don't necessarily need it to render every time while you're doing the rest of your show. So one of the things that you could do is come in here to the model, select all of the effects, then come over, right click and disable render on them. Now it does update the color when they're selected to, it did update the color to yellow. It's meant to do that all the time. That's a bug as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, it disables the rendering, and if you put your mouse over the top of it and you look down here in the bar, you'll see it does show up that it is disabled, which means that it won't render. And so when I click on it, I'm just seeing the previous render data, and if I rendered all and then clicked on it, there would be nothing there. It's erased all of that data, it's all gone away. And then of course I can come back, select all the effects again, go to the model, select all effects, and right click and enable renderer, and then I can render it all and send it up to my show. So for people that have really large sequences, really slow render times, a way to try and save them a bit of time and strip out some work that doesn't need to be done on an ongoing basis. The next change related to the star model. This was a bit of a fraught change. It took me a long time to get the star model working exactly the way I wanted. The multiple layers, etc. There was a change at one point here where we added this layers, and we standardized all of the models so that they all have this layers property. So the wreath, etc. have this layers property, and it's consistently labeled inside and outside. And along the way, I missed a bunch of things, and it got pretty ugly there for a while with things not working correctly, but I think it's now all fixed. One of the things that changed at the same time was I also added to the starting locations, and it used to be your only real starting locations were in the crotch of the star or at the tip of the head of the star. There were no other options, but I've always felt like the left and the right foot were sensible starting locations as well. Because, as you run your wire up to the star, the first point that you get to is one of the feet. And so I always felt like it made sense to start there if you could. And so there are now these left and right bottoms, clockwise and counterclockwise, which are now optional render starting locations if you'd like to use them for your stars. The reason, actually, while I'm at it, so one of the reasons why I changed all of these layers and did the work that I did on this, which, at the end of the day didn't necessarily look like it was necessary, but it was. And the reason it was necessary was previously, if you had a star with 2 layers or more layers which were the same size, it actually would not display the star correctly. It would actually overlay the star pixels on top of each other, because the number of pixels was actually the determinant of where on the star it existed. So it always assumed that the closer you were to the center, the fewer pixels you had. And so when you had multiple layers with the same number of pixels, and this was particularly true, I think, on one of the GE models where his inner two layers on his star had like 10 pixels in it, and it just didn't work. Produced all sorts of weird results with those two stars basically sitting in the same locations. So I had to make changes to the star model. I made those changes a while ago, and it kind of worked, but then, you know, as the stars got bigger, it stopped working. And so this is basically a fundamental rewrite of the star model to guarantee that these things appropriately get separated, even when you do weird things like, you know, I can even put 10 pixels on the outside of the star and it will still come up correctly as a valid star. Whereas previously those 10 pixels would have automatically gone in the middle, and it would have assumed that this was the inside instead of the outside. So this gives you a little bit more explicit control, albeit that it was a little painful to get there. The next change, again, I'm not going to show this, but for some time now we have actually offered a Vixen 3 import. It's not commonly used. It brings in timing tracks reasonably well. It brings in effects reasonably well in terms of the type of effect. It doesn't get the settings very correct. In fact, most of that code's missing, mainly because I don't really have the data that I need to go and work out how to reproduce things. But I did in 2020.43 spend a bunch of time with a user that was particularly keen to bring his sequences across to get his colors correct. And so there was some changes made in the import which tries to bring the colors across correctly from Vixen. Now, it probably won't do what we would call a color curve or a gradient. It probably won't do those very well, but it should bring across the absolute colors fairly well. 2020.43 was also where I added the ability to tag shadow models. And I did this, and look, it's not perfect, but it actually works for my show, so I'll show it to you in my show. So I use shadow models behind these baubles, and the reason I do that is because these baubles are made up of both bullet nodes and strip light, which of course have a different color order to them, which of course you cannot represent in a single model and upload it to the controller. And so what I have is I have on my unassigned tab these straight lines here which represent, you know, the inside and the outside of those various baubles. And one of the things that I've done with this is I've said down here that these things are shadow models for the original prop which shows up on my main layout. And what this does is it stops these overlapping channels getting reported in the check sequence, which is kind of nice because everyone likes a clean check sequence and likes to try and keep that to a minimum. So because I've got two models here which shadow another model, I'm able to say that this model and this model shadow the other model, and that suppresses the error. It gets more complex if the relationship is more complex than that. And so it doesn't always allow you to suppress the errors, but in this case it does. For each one of these, the shadow model is represented. Now the shadow model is not represented on the other side. So if I go back to my default, there is no shadow model here, and there doesn't need to be. The shadow model relationship doesn't have to be both ways. Just one side is enough, and when the check sequence runs, it checks both sides, and if one says it's a shadow model for another, both of them assume that overlapping channels are okay and intended, and it won't report it as an error. So also in 2020.43, Dan made some changes again to FPP. FPP Connect, in this case, some things that minimize some uploads if not necessary, such as not uploading the UDP outputs if there's no actual inputs defined for the controller, and some things like that. So now we're at 2020.44, again changes to FPP Connect to support single channel pixel configuration, so Dan put that in. He also added left and right scroll wheel support to the visualizer, so if you're in the visualizer here and we need to make the box size a bit bigger, so it's there. You can now hold the shift key down and scroll left and right, or not hold the shift key down and scroll up and down. There was also changes in 2020.44 to the the models export. So in the models export, where you can access via the tools menu. Let's throw this onto the desktop. So here's the models export, and Scott separated some more of the properties over here on the end to make sure that everything is nice and easy to read or sort on or access. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand, and I actually rely on sometimes, is the ability to come in here and look at the default buffer, particularly for model groups, because that's not really obvious anywhere else, but you can access it here in the model export. So you can, when you do a minimal grid, you can work out actually how big is that minimal grid by coming in here. And you'll notice that it's never higher than 400, and that's because the minimal grid defaults to maximum of 400, which you can control, but that's the default that happens to get set. The next one was a change to the warp effect. I added a copy and a mirror function, and then I went and made a video on back-to-back tune to signs. So again, I'm not going to go in and demonstrate this again. You can go and watch that video. But essentially what it allows you to do is to take a particular prop, typically a matrix, and mirror the sequencing on both sides without having to sequence it twice. So if you were doing a back-to-back tune to sign, or maybe you had two columns and you always wanted them to have the same sequencing on it, you could sequence it as a single model and then use this warp effect to basically either reflect or duplicate the content on both sides. So now we're in 2020-45. There was a change here where Paul T increased the maximum number of nodes supported in the icicles model. I can't remember what the previous maximum was, but Paul needed it bigger, and so now it's 2000. So plenty of nodes in your icicles. There were also some changes to the Falcon controllers. I did add additional variants here to support situations where people were running remotes off one of the serial ports but not adding an expansion board, and so this still splits the controller into two banks but only adds the 4 extra ports that it would use for people that don't want to disable one of their main 16. They want the extras and they're willing to give up the banking split that goes on. This allows you to configure it that way. This also does likewise, but this adds the 1 expansion and also uses one of the serial ports. So basically it puts the controller in 3 bank mode and uses one of those banks to drive a set of remotes off the serial port. We're at 46 now. The reason there's not so many changes here, a couple of reasons. We're obviously now in November and the enhancement list is starting to get a bit thinner from release to release, but also I've covered a lot of the changes here in earlier comments when we hit these things. There was a change in this one, and there was a subsequent change as well to this as well, but now on Falcon boards you can set the default port brightness, and if I set this to 30%, then every port on the controller will now be at 30% unless you specifically tell it to be some other brightness. So if you're in a habit of not running your controllers very bright, you can set a default brightness here and every port will go to that setting. And if you want to run something brighter, you actually have to then go and explicitly say, hey, I want this port brighter. For people that tend to run their ports with lots of pixels and don't try to avoid power injection by driving their brightness down, this can be a bit of a shortcut to save you having to go and set that on every model. It can also protect you from those situations where you accidentally plug things into the wrong port and blow a fuse as a result. There was also some changes at this point. This was actually in the preferences dialog and I missed it earlier when I was talking about the changes here, but there was a change here, this checkbox down here, prompt issues during batch render. So at the moment it's disabled, and it's now, I believe, disabled by default. And so what happens when you run a batch render, there's actually a bunch of errors that can happen during the batch render. Things like missing models. You can have excessive channel counts, which trigger errors, things like that. And because batch render is really one of those circumstances where you just want to get stuff done, and by now you should have rendered the thing separately as you were developing the sequence. And so rather than stopping the batch render, you can now tell it not to prompt for issues, and it will just render all the way through, issues and all. If there were any models that you've deleted, it will just not render them. It'll drop the effects silently. Now, it won't change the underlying sequence file. So if you go and open up the sequence, you'll still get all the usual prompts to fix the problem up. So it doesn't break anything permanently, but it does stop the batch render failing, which can be useful if, particularly if you leave it to run overnight and second sequence in, the damn thing stops, and in the morning you're sitting there going, what the hell? I thought this was all going to work, and now it's stuck with some silly message on the screen. I added a new DMX model type here called a general type. We've always supported a general type. It's just it was always buried in one of the other models, and so I decided to create something that pulls out the generic DMX model and just makes it a standalone type of model. Effectively what this is a bunch of DMX channels, and so down here you can set the number of channels. You can choose to make them red, green, blue and white if you do have those sorts of things. So you would just set this to 1, 2, 3 and 4. As usual, you would typically name the nodes. So you'd come into the strand node names and you'd say, well, yeah, this was red, this was green, this was blue, this was white, I don't know, this is fan, this is strobe, this is, I don't know, dimming, and something else, right? So I can put any sorts of properties. Maybe this is a snow machine, right? Maybe this is a bubble machine. Maybe that's bubbles, and so forth. And then when I sequence that particular model, there it is at the top. And so here it is here. And so if I throw a DMX effect down on it and I start twiddling the knobs here, the way it shows them is it draws the bars. For the RGB channels, obviously it's smart enough to know that that's what those things are. But yeah, I can set these things. I can put a value curve on this one. I put a zigzag on it. And as it plays, the bar moves proportional to the data. So you can see what it's doing. You can see all of its names, etc. But it doesn't represent it as anything else. So now we're at 2020-49. Dan made some under-the-covers changes to the FSCQ file definition. I don't think that he's actually actively using these yet, but basically he's added some changes which allow for potentially larger FSCQ files, which I no doubt we will get to at some point. So now we're at 2020.50. This is relevant to, I don't know, let's just choose one of these models here. So on both the submodel dialog and this dialog here, I think I've added the ability for you to actually go and find it. Sometimes it can be really hard to find, well, where's the first node on this model? So now if you're in here, you can press Control F and press enter, and it will jump down and select the first node for you, or you can go and select the 33rd node, etc. So really, really quick finds. Quick way to find the nodes. And I believe you can do that in the submodel dialog as well. So quickly find the node on the model. Scott also added sideways scrolling, I think it was on here. So if I shrink this up a little bit, you can scroll left and right using the shift key, and up and down without the shift key. So he added that. Scott also added a change to the picture effect. On the picture effect, he added an additional property here for scaling, scale keep aspect ratio, and crop it. I believe it crops it so that it doesn't leave the black bar, so it crops it according to what it needs to in order to keep it, to fill the screen but not leave any blackness on it, and not distort the picture at all. Added export controller connection. So this Scott added this to the tools menu. So this export controller connections here. Again, we'll throw that into our desktop. And so this gives me across all of my controllers, all of the models. So whereas previously we showed in the visualizer that you could export one of these at a time, this allows you to export all of them at once and take it out so that when you're plugging your show in, you know which things should be plugged in what order, on what ports. Okay, so now we're up to 2020.52. We're almost there. Some changes here, some performance optimizations on OS X for shaders and supporting for eGPUs to improve performance there. Okay, in 2020.52 we also added support for websites like this one. This is coolers.co. It allows you to generate color palettes. So if you're lacking a little in creativity, or you've got a mental block and you need a color palette for that latest song, you can come here to this web page. You can press the space key as many times as you like until you find a palette that maybe appeals to you. Yeah, maybe something like that, nice reds and yellows. And then you can come up here to export and you can export it. Now, as at this release, we now support this SVG format, but also there was previously support for the CSS format, but it was kind of broken, and that's also been fixed. So you can export this palette to an SVG file. And so here's the SVG file here. And what we will do is we will copy that file and we will place that into our show folder. And the next time we open up xLights, it will appear in this drop down. And down here there's, well, no, it's probably not there. It was in a previous test folder. But yeah, basically that palette will appear in this drop down. And of course, if I've got the color droppy here, it will also get added into, all the colors will get added onto here as well, so that I have access to them. So if you're feeling a little bit stuck for the colors that you want to choose for your latest song, head over to a website like this. It's cheap, it's free. You just keep pressing the space bar until you love a color. You can always go back if you go too far and export it and then bring it in as a color palette in xLights, and you can start sequencing again with that latest set of colors. In this release, I also changed the granularity on color curves. So, sorry, on color curves, on value curves. So this range here, when we first released value curves, the granularity across here was 40. And so when you were in custom, you effectively could only have 4 data points horizontally along here, which meant that, particularly with a long effect, you didn't get a great deal of granularity. Each dot could be as many as several seconds apart. Some time ago, I increased the granularity to 100, and in 2020.52, I think I doubled it again to 200. So it allows you to create much more detailed or finer transitions, etc., when you're using your value curves. Now, I don't suggest you go to town on it. There is a fairly significant overhead with custom value curves with hundreds of points, but if you really need it, I guess it's there if you need it. The next one was on batch render, just a really simple change. Someone asked if I could do it and I said sure. So now when you select it, it now gives you a count up here of the numbers selected. So if you know you've got 10 sequences, you can rattle through the list, selecting each one until you see it gets to 10, and then you know you've got all the ones that you probably meant to have. Okay, 2020.52. So this also added another new output protocol. In this case, it was an Ethernet protocol, and in order to access this, you need to not have any brand of controller set, because I don't know of any controller at the moment that supports this, although I'm sure we'll find one. But the protocol is actually the Kynet protocol. And the Kynet protocol has 2 versions, so you do get to set the version of the protocol that you want to use. And this allows you to effectively, as I understand it, this is I believe it's a Philips protocol, and it's used for controlling lights on architectural type situation. So who knows, someone might start sequencing one of these skyscrapers with xLights one of these days. Add sort of nodes to rows in submodel dialog. So again, this was Scott. I think if I use this model here, it will allow me to demonstrate it. So these here are deliberately not sorted. This is intentional, they're not meant to be sorted, but there is a sort row thing over here. So if I wanted to, I could sort it, and it basically joins them all together and puts them in model order. Not something I'd actually want to do in this particular situation, but in some other situations you may want to do, and you can see how it reduces the number of numbers here and makes it very efficient. That's also a little bit faster to load and parse, etc. So it's not a bad idea. Add click and drag and double click select to the submodel preview. So Scott made a video on this. You know, historically, if you wanted to go in and select nodes, you would come over here and you'd double click here, and then you'd come over and double click on nodes, or you could highlight an area and say select those. Oh, that's ordered selection. That's why I can't do it. I'd say select all, and it would, or select none, or I'd highlight them and it would select them, or it would unselect them, and the like, which is all well and good, but it's also nice to be able to do it on here. And so Scott's added the ability for you to do it directly on here as well. He also allows you to click on these things or double click on them. Is it double click or single click? I think it's single click. Yeah, it's single click. No, it's double click. I lied, it's double click. As another way to do it, and obviously it's placing things into this row here because that happens to be the row that's got focused. So another way to generate the submodels. Now, this won't do ordering. You'll notice that it's grouping everything together, so it doesn't allow you to do ordered node selection, which is sometimes important. So in that case, you'll need to go in and go in this way and select the ordered selection and go through that process here. So now we're at 2020.54. And there was only one change in this one, and essentially it's exactly the same change, except Scott added it to the states dialog and the faces dialog, but a similar concept, the ability to come in here, add a face, go to node ranges, click on the face outline, and I can come over here and click and drag and select the nodes that I want to include or exclude. I think it's, yeah, so if I hold the shift key down and click and drag, it unselects, whereas if I click and drag without holding the shift key down, it selects. So yeah, so he added that to both states and faces as well. We're now at 2020.55. So this change here is actually visible right here. We're currently on a model, and this model happens to belong into a bunch of groups, and this is now shown as a property of the model. Now, because it's so many groups, it obviously runs off the end of the screen, but if you hold your mouse over it, you do get this useful tooltip that displays the list of groups that this model happens to be a member of. Now, this is actually this is not just the things that the model is a member of. It will also pick up situations where a submodel of the model is a member of a group. It will also add it in here. So this can be a great way to track down things like situations where you've got spurious pixels lighting up and you're not sure why, and this is a quick way to go and check, well, what groups is that model a member of? Is it a member of something that maybe it shouldn't be a member of, and maybe that explains why that's happening. So it's really there mostly for troubleshooting. Okay, and so now we're finally up to 2020.56, which is the current release. Not a lot in the current release in terms of enhancements. There's a slight enhancement on the display elements here. I've added, don't forget, if you hold the control key down, it won't dock. I've added an additional sort option down here by controller port with groups at the top, by size, or just groups at the top. And so what this does is it groups all the models so that all the models which are on the same port will automatically be together and generally in order. That's based on its start channel. So if you do something funky with out of order models using manually set up virtual strings, etc., they won't necessarily be in order, but generally they will be. And then obviously as you go through the ports. So this is under the assumption that you generally want to sequence things that are on controllers at similar times, or similar things are on the same controller. And so this grouping here might be useful to you. It might not be. It might save you some time. And that is it for the xLights changes. Now, there were a couple other changes that I do want to touch quickly on, and one of them was actually in 2020.56. In 2020.56 there was actually a new utility added. It's only available on Windows, I believe, in this release, and that's this utility here called xScanner. Now, you will need to give this access to your firewalls, etc. It's popped up on the other screen. There it is there. And it basically will sit here for quite some time. This is not a fast program to run. What this program is doing is essentially an IP scan. So you would have used, Angry IP Scanner or something like that to scan your network, looking for, maybe trying to find a controller or find an IP address of your FPP, etc. The difference with this tool is that this tool is basically lighting aware. So it knows about FPP, it knows about Falcons, it knows about SAN devices and Hinks Pixes and all those sorts of things. And so it's doing a much deeper scan than one of those IP scanners would do. It's looking inside your xLights configuration and trying to understand what's there. It's looking out at the network and seeing what devices are on the network. If it finds an FPP, it's going in and looking at the FPP's configuration to understand, is there a second network on the FPP, and maybe there are some controllers there and things like that. So a reasonably deep network scan. Now, it's obviously limited to the capabilities of the network. So, it can't, jump network boundaries that aren't configured correctly and find things beyond. But if you have put in place things like proxies and the like, it will go through those proxies and look for your controllers on the other side of the proxies as well, and bring back a number of details. Now, this tool, it's a version 1.0 tool. It's not perfect. I know it crashes in some circumstances. I still haven't got to the bottom of all of them. I think we fixed one today. But the idea of it was that you would use this sort of tool when you were coming in and doing some troubleshooting, because it would do that deep scan and allow people to see, what's on your network, where's your FPP, how's it configured, what's connected to it, and so forth. So we'll give it a couple of seconds. Okay, so the tool's complete, and this is what you get. Essentially, it's a multi-column tree control. At the top, it shows my show folders, my xSchedule and my xLights happen to be the same, which is nice. It comes in, and this is my home network, so it's gone and scanned all of the devices that are there. It's done a lookup using a service out there which reverses the MAC address and tries to work out who owns it, so you can see the routers and things like that. It's also done things like identified, I've got a J1 sys that's plugged in here. It doesn't give me a great deal of details, but it does tell me that it's there and it's worked. Even the Avitech comes up, and it's worked out what type of Avitech it is and the like. Once you get to the Falcons, it gives you a little bit more details, like things like the bank sizes will start to appear. It shows the mode that it's in. This is actually not right. I have to work on this with the F48. That's definitely not in player mode. These are more correct. These are in E131 ArtNet mode. Again, it gives me the bank sizes and the like. So that's all correct. I also have some FPPs here. So here it's showing me the networks. This one happens to only have a single network, so only the E0 was here. But if you had a WLAN, it would also show you the WLAN. It'll show me the exact version of FPP, and again the mode that the FPP happens to be in. all of that's there. Now, this is not actually my show. My show is running on another network at the moment, which happens to be unreachable. So here they appear all down here. It knows about them because obviously it read them out of my xLights configuration. So it does show them here, but it shows up as the ping failed. It couldn't get to them, but it does at least list those details for me. So I don't lose the fact they're there. So there's a lot of information that potentially will help when you're facing issues in the Zoom room and someone wants to help you, or even if you're just at home and you can't find your FPP. This will do a deep network scan and guarantees that it's going to find your controllers pretty much, and it will tell you, hey, this one's an FPP, and give you its web address and its wireless LAN address and everything else. So I'm hoping that will help people with their troubleshooting. You can export this to a CSV if you right click anywhere on here, and it will write it out to a CSV file that you can then email to someone or something like that if you wanted to. So that's xScanner. Now, there were a couple of schedule changes that I will very, very, very quickly run through. Not to belabor it, there's just a handful of things that I haven't previously covered in other videos, given that I already did a fairly comprehensive video. There was a change in the schedule to support hard stops. So if you want the schedule to hard stop at the end time in the middle of the song, just stop dead, you can select the hard stop there and it will do that. There was also a change in the options here. There was a change that allows you to minimize UI updates for performance reasons. So if you're encountering performance reasons, and I made a whole video on all of the reasons why you might have issues with xSchedules and how to fix it, etc. And one of the things that you can do if you get totally desperate is you can turn these UI updates off. Essentially, this disables all of the ping display here, and it also removes some of the status details down here, which are not essential to running your show. It will still show you the song that's playing and the time, etc. When I was working on this in consulting with some other users, we decided that was kind of essential, but these things were considered non-essential, and so we created the option to disable that. I also added this disable output on local ping failure. This is something that works somewhat similar to what the FPP monitor function does. It has the same problems as well. What it does is it monitors the ping results, and when it encounters a device with a ping result, xSchedule will stop sending data to that controller until the next ping success result, and then it will turn it back on again. Now, that's fine and good and can help avoid some issues that can occur when a controller goes offline and your show starts to lag. And in my performance video, I go through and explain why that happens. And so this can stop that lag from continuing. However, the downside of it is if you do get a spurious ping failure, it can take a controller offline, and that looks like a frozen controller. All the lights on that controller just stay on while your song plays, which, to be honest, is really not that much of a better outcome, particularly if you get these spurious failures from time to time. So look, it's disabled by default. Feel free to play with it, experiment with it. It only pings like once a minute, so it can take a minute for things to come back online again. I think FPP pings a little bit more often, and I could change that, but at the moment that's how it's configured. This is an interesting opportunity. I'm just picking a random sequence here. Oh, hang on, I don't want to do that. I want to edit it. And I'll pick a random sequence here. Now, there are these blend modes, and where you're running multiple sequences at once, you can actually blend them into one another and overwrite things. I did add another blend mode, which is a brightness, and so you can create a sequence, maybe a global sequence, which does a fade from white to black. And if you play that sequence over the top of your sequence with this brightness thing, it will effectively let your sequence continue to play at full brightness, but it will have the effect of lowering the brightness over the duration of that sequence that you play over the top of it. So potentially create some ways in which you can merge things together and achieve a display outcome that was otherwise very, very difficult to work with. There was also some changes to Remote Falcon in the plugins here. There was some additional settings that were added. Here's the Remote Falcon plugin. And so under the options, there are now some options here around controlling which playlists that the Remote Falcon is enabled in. So you might want to have the Remote Falcon during your main show, but you might run an after show music selection and you don't want people coming along and using Remote Falcon during that time. So you can constrain the playlists that it plays through. You can also enable or disable Remote Falcon on the website when it's not playing. So outside, when this Christmas sequence finishes, it will send a message to the Remote Falcon website which will show that the show's no longer available and people can't do voting and selection. And then when this sequence starts again, it will go back to the website and say, yeah, you can let people choose their songs or vote or whatever it is that you happen to have done. So yeah, couple of additional settings there to match the functionality that James has been adding over there on Remote Falcon. A couple of other changes. So when you're defining things like matrices, you need to in here define the start channel, and normally you would type an absolute channel in, and you have been able to do the #universe : start channel format. You can now do the apostrophe controller name : start channel format as well. Previously wasn't supported, but it is supported now, which is, with these days with people using Visualizer, that's the most common way that people do set start channels. I have added some tooltips on here so you can see the IP of the controller here. I also added the web listening port down here. So if you want to access the web page, you need to use port 81. And so whatever you've set it to, it will show up down here so you know how to do it. If you had a serial controller, it will now also show any serial controllers on here, including which COM port they're attached to, so you can see essentially whether they have opened successfully or not. So when the sequence starts, it will come up green, and when the sequence is not playing, it'll be in amber because the state's kind of not determined. It doesn't go and open it to see if it's going to open. It only shows that it's open or closed during the actual song itself. I also added over here the date of each render. So if you've done a render, you will be able to look here and see whether that's actually the correct date, to make sure that you're not picking up an old FSCQ file. It also here shows you the number of channels that are in the FSCQ file. So you can see here that I've got a couple of FSCQ files here that are suspicious because they seem to have the wrong number of channels. Actually, it's the reverse. I think the 70,000s are incorrect. I think my show's now 33,000 now that I've got rid of, I think there was a P10 panel back when I did this, and that's now all gone, and so my show's shrunk down a little bit. So again, a way to quickly spot anomalies in your FSCQ files. I'd know here that, hey, I probably need to go back into a batch render because there's something funky going on here. So there was one other change, and the other change was actually to a utility program that gets installed with xLights, which very few people use, and that's not surprising. It's really designed to support some very specific situations. So if you go into your xLights folder in program files on a Windows machine, I'm not sure, I assume it's not in the OS X build now that Dan is only building xLights itself, but there is a tool in here called xCapture, and this tool is designed to be used with another show playing device, and it's designed to capture the network traffic and convert it into a FSCQ file which you could then play using xSchedule or FPP instead. So if you've got a fairly expensive show player that's potentially, you don't want to leave exposed, you can capture its output into an FSCQ file and then use something like FPP to play the show and not worry so much that that device might be lost or that expensive license key might be lost when it's playing. Now the change that was added was this fill in missing frames with prior frame data, and so effectively what's happening here is xCapture is capturing these network packets. Now the network packets are probably sent out at a typical 50 milliseconds or something, but they don't necessarily arrive at exactly that timing, and so xCapture is doing its best to reassemble things into a sensible format, and every now and then there just will be a missing data. There just a packet won't arrive for some reason. Maybe it didn't get sent, maybe it got lost or dropped, etc. And so with this option here, what xCapture will do is fill in that data with the prior frame and basically hold the frame for an extra frames period to ensure that the file is proper and valid. And so that's the only change that's happened here. So that's it, guys. That brings us up to date to 2020.56, very close to, if not the last version of xLights for 2020. Look, it's been a mad year for a whole bunch of reasons. I hope all of your shows have been an absolute fabulous success, and we look forward to working with you next year. Cheers, guys.